Atlantic, an ocean that the West has considered its certainty for decades as a space it has under control. And now comes a warning from the British Navy, which speaks clearly. This advantage is falling apart. The threat has a name, Russia, and it doesn't attack the way we would expect. No fleets on the horizon, no missiles above the surface. Everything important is happening underwater, quietly, out of the public eye. The highest commander of the British Navy says that the Atlantic, which used to connect Europe and America, is no longer safe. If confirmed, this isn't just about Britain. This concerns NATO logistics and the West's crisis response. Now, the key point. This isn't coming from an analyst or politician. This comes from someone with actual sea data on their desk. That's why we need to understand what he meant and what follows from it. This video covers recent changes in the Atlantic and why the British Navy is currently raising concerns. We'll take a look at exactly what the head of the Royal Navy said, why he directly named Russia as a threat, and what he actually meant when he talked about losing superiority. We'll gradually break down how Russia is advancing in the Atlantic, what it's focusing on, and why this is much more dangerous for the West than a classic naval confrontation. We'll also show the current state of the British Navy, its strengths, and conversely, where cracks are emerging that Moscow is closely monitoring. And an important thing right at the start, this is not a hypothetical debate about a distant future. According to the British, it's happening already. The question isn't if the Atlantic becomes a problem, but when and under what conditions. That's exactly what everything else we'll discuss next depends on. A specific warning. We're losing the Atlantic. Gwyn Jenkins isn't a media personality or politician pushing rhetorical boundaries. He is the top professional commander in the British Navy, and now he has warned that Britain is close to losing its advantage in the Atlantic for the first time since World War II. Not in the future, not theoretically, but now. He used the phrase that the advantage the West has taken for granted since the end of the Cold War is now seriously threatened. He admitted Britain and its allies still have the upper hand, but just barely. And he immediately added that with the current developments, there is no room for complacency with the state of affairs that has existed for the past decades. According to him, that would be a mistake. He explained where he saw the problem, saying his main concern isn't about sea level. He said that what is happening below the surface is what worries him the most. That's exactly where he believes Russia is advancing most. He mentioned Russia specifically. He said that Russia is massively investing in naval and especially underwater capabilities. And that's even though it's fighting a draining war in Ukraine. According to Jenkins, it's a clear sign that Moscow considers the Atlantic a key area for future conflicts. And then came the sentence that is at the core of the entire warning. Jenkins said that if Britain and its allies don't increase the pace of modernization and investment, the advantage in the Atlantic will be lost. Not suddenly, but gradually. And once it's lost, getting it back will be much harder than keeping it today. This isn't the language of a diplomat. This is the language of a commander describing an ongoing process. Something that's already happening. Something happening out of sight, beneath the surface. That's why we need to explain now what it really means to lose dominance in the Atlantic. Because it has nothing to do with maps in textbooks, but with the West's ability to wage war at all. What it means to lose dominance in the Atlantic. Losing Atlantic dominance doesn't mean Russian ships will patrol Britain's shores tomorrow. It means something much more subtle and at the same time much more dangerous. It means that the West is losing certainty about what is happening in the Atlantic and who has the initiative. The Atlantic has been considered a safe space for decades, not because there weren't Russian submarines there, but because NATO had the ability to track them, restrict them, and quickly neutralize them in case of a crisis. According to the British, this capability is weakening today, not suddenly, but gradually. And that's exactly the problem. The decisive battle doesn't take place on the surface. It takes place beneath it. In a space where there are no satellite images, where public oversight doesn't work, and where the advantage goes to the one who is quieter, more patient, and better prepared. If the West loses track of the movement of Russian submarines, it loses more than just a tactical advantage. It loses time, and in a crisis, time is crucial. In practice, this means that during an escalation, NATO couldn't be sure it could safely move reinforcements from America to Europe. It would not be certain that its data connection works without risk, and it would not be certain that it has the first hours of the conflict under control. And it's those first hours that are decisive. Here's a fundamental paradox. The Atlantic doesn't seem dangerous. There's no fire or visible front. And that's exactly why it can become the place where the West loses even before it realizes that the conflict has even started. In the next chapter, we'll look at exactly how Russia is playing this game, what tools it uses, why it doesn't need a huge fleet, and why the underwater world is its perfect battlefield. How Russia plays the Atlantic game. Russia doesn't play in the Atlantic the way the West knew it in the past. It doesn't seek visible dominance or control the sea through ship numbers or flag strength. Its strategy is simpler yet more dangerous. To be invisible, to be silent, and to be ready to act at the right moment. Russia's main strategy centers on the underwater domain. That's where Moscow concentrates its biggest investments. Modern Yasen-class attack submarines are designed to be extremely quiet and capable of operating deep in the North Atlantic for weeks without detection. Their role is not just military. They are mobile sensors that collect data on NATO ship movements, convoy routes, and the reaction times of Western navies. Alongside them are Borei-class strategic submarines, which carry nuclear missiles. These are not intended for a first strike. They are a safeguard. Their very presence in the Atlantic creates pressure because it forces NATO to devote enormous resources to tracking them. And the more resources you tie up in defense, the fewer you have for initiative. However, Russia isn't only using military platforms. In the Atlantic, specialized ships are also systematically operating, which officially present themselves as research or auxiliary vessels. Their real task is mapping the underwater infrastructure, data cables, power connections, places where the digital life of the West is concentrated. Their destruction wouldn't cause coastal explosions. It would cause chaos in communication, finance, and command. Now comes the key paradox. For Russia to gain an advantage in the Atlantic, it doesn't need to control the ocean. It just needs to create doubt. Uncertainty if NATO locates its adversary in a crisis. Uncertainty about supply route safety. Uncertainty about the reliability of communications in modern warfare is exactly what makes this strategy effective. It's cheaper than a conventional fleet. It's harder to detect, and it forces the West to react defensively. Russia doesn't have to win in the Atlantic. Just change the game rules. In the next chapter, we'll look at the other side of the equation, at the British Navy, at what its real capabilities are, where it is still strong, and where weaknesses are starting to appear that make this warning so urgent. The British Navy, a force that can't keep up. Britain is not a naval dwarf. The Royal Navy is one of the world's most advanced fleets and remains top-notch in some areas. The issue isn't quality, but pace, in how quickly it can adapt to what Russia is doing in the Atlantic. The backbone of British capabilities in underwater warfare are the Astute-class attack submarines. They are modern, well-armed, and extremely quiet. On paper, it's one of the best platforms of its kind. In reality, however, there are few of them. Each long-term maintenance instantly limits Britain's ability to continuously cover the North Atlantic. A similar issue appears on the surface too. Britain operates modern destroyers and frigates, but in terms of numbers, they can't create a permanent presence on the scale that the current situation would require. Aircraft carriers may look impressive, but they're not the solution to a problem that's happening deep beneath the surface. The key factor is the human and logistical pressure. The Royal Navy has long faced a personnel shortage and often requires one ship to fill several roles. This reduces flexibility. And flexibility is crucial in the fight against a silent, dispersed threat. The British command knows this. That's why Jenkins says it's about more than just having more ships. It's a different mindset. About a networked approach, about sensors, autonomous systems, and the ability to see below the surface continuously. Not only when you send a ship there, this is where the circle closes. Britain is not weak today, but its navy is facing major problems. And if the pace doesn't change, it could become slow. There's a simple rule in the Atlantic. Whoever is slower to adapt loses before they even realize it. In the next chapter, we'll look at why the Atlantic is critical not just for Britain, but for all of NATO. And what would happen if this silent balance broke? Why is the Atlantic existential for NATO? The Atlantic isn't just water between Europe and America. It's the space on which NATO's entire security model stands. If the Atlantic doesn't work, the alliance doesn't work. And that's exactly why it's so sensitive to what happens beneath its surface. In the event of a crisis or war, Europe without the Atlantic would not be able to sustain a long-term conflict. Most of the heavy equipment, ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements would come from the United States. Air transport can only move a fraction of what's needed. The sea is decisive. What matters is being sure these routes are safe. The Atlantic is also the West's digital artery. Undersea data cables carry the vast majority of communication between America and Europe. Financial transactions, military command, intelligence, satellite links. If they were disrupted, the consequences wouldn't be explosions, but delays, outages, and chaos in decision-making. And that's exactly the scenario that would suit Rusko. Here comes another paradox. NATO is the strongest military alliance in the world, but at the same time, it's extremely dependent on smooth operations, on logistics, on communication, on the rapid movement of forces. If someone can disrupt this smooth operation without crossing a clear red line, they gain a strategic advantage even before an open conflict begins. This brings us back to London's warning. Jenkins isn't talking about Russia planning an immediate attack on the Atlantic. He's talking about Russia preparing the conditions so that in case of a crisis, it can decide on the pace, on escalation, and on who will respond and who will have to improvise. Losing superiority in the Atlantic wouldn't mean NATO's immediate defeat. It would mean losing the initiative. In modern conflicts, initiative often outweighs weapon quantity. That's why it's not a question of whether the West has enough ships or submarines. The question is if it will realize the rules have already changed in time. And this is where we get to the most important thing that comes from this warning. Conclusion. The Atlantic is quietly disappearing. The warning from Britain is not about panic or an imminent war. It's about an undeniable trend. The Atlantic isn't becoming a battlefield, but rather a zone of uncertainty. And in this uncertainty, the advantage goes to the one who is ready to act before the other side realizes that something is happening. Russia doesn't need to control the Atlantic. It's enough for them to undermine the certainty that NATO has it under control. It creates enough pressure to make the West react more cautiously and defensively. That's exactly what the British Navy warns. If Jenkins is right, the decisive moment won't be the first shot. It will happen when someone questions if the Atlantic is still safe. If the answer isn't clear, the advantage will be lost. Now it's up to the West. It will either realize a new game is being played behind the scenes or eventually face rules it didn't create and must react. So the question isn't whether the Atlantic is the problem. The question is whether we'll realize it before it becomes a weak spot.
If you liked the video, I'd appreciate a like and make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next ones I'm working on. Show gratitude to support my work. To help the video reach more people, click praise. Thank you.